Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into today's Author Talk series brought to you by the Library Speakers Consortium. The Library Speakers Consortium is a partnership of more than 300 library systems across the United States and Canada with the goal of making Author Talks more accessible to communities of all sizes. I am Brandon Adler, your host and moderator in conversation with each of our wonderful, best-selling, prize-winning, and acclaimed authors that you will hear from throughout our series. Today, we are so honored and excited to host New York Times bestselling author and anti-racist educator, Britt Hawthorne, as she presents some important highlights from her book, Raising Antiracist Children, A Practical Parenting Guide. Hi, Britt, how are you?
Hi, Brandon. I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here today.
Thank you so much for being here. Before we jump in and turn things over to Britt, I just want to pause and let everybody kind of know that standard housekeeping information that lets everything run more smoothly throughout our webinar. We have compiled some viewer questions that were pre-submitted with registration, but viewers may also submit questions during this presentation. So when you have a question that you'd like to submit to Britt, please click the questions button below the live stream to submit that question as we progress through the webinar. In addition, we invite you to interact with your fellow viewers in the live chat box, also located below the live stream. It's always fun to see where everybody's tuning in from. And for today, if you haven't joined us for a webinar or an author talk before, you'll notice that the setup might be a little bit different. Britt will present for the first 40 to 45 minutes, and then we will hold an audience Q&A for the last 15 to 20 minutes of our hour. So please keep in mind that there are quite a few of you tuning in today, and we will take as many questions as we can during the Q&A period. If you are unable to attend the full talk for any reason, you will receive a thank you for attending email in about 24 hours. And in that email, you can find a link to the recording. Now, to formally introduce our guest for today, Britt Hawthorne is an anti-racist teacher and educator committed to raising a generation of anti-racist children by centering families of the global majority and fostering equitable learning environments for students and children of all ages and backgrounds. Britt's work moves the idea of equity in education from a goal to reality. She partners with action-oriented educators to create classroom environments that are inclusive and equitable for all learners. Once again, welcome, Britt. Thank you so much for being here. I'll turn things over to you now.
Thank you again, Brandon. And thank you everyone for tuning in today. Again, I am excited and honored to be in community with you. I would like to spend this time just highlighting some pieces that are in my book and hopefully make those pieces really come alive for you in our session. I started doing land acknowledgements in 2018. And at that time, land acknowledgements, I have to be honest, seemed really big and scary to me, particularly because I was centering myself, my own comfort, and I had this idea that the goal was perfection. Now in 2023, I certainly know that the goal will never be perfection and there's not a destination to arrive to. And as soon as we start to think that I have to try to be perfect or that I have to think that mistakes do not belong here, that is when we start to become performative in the work. You'll find on page 236, if you have a copy of my book, I hope you check it out from your local library, that I talk a little bit more about loving the land and loving the people. And so a big part of that is looking at the land as having the same rights as people. In our home, myself and our children have written land acknowledgements, and I would like to acknowledge the Alabama Coushatta tribe as one of the federally recognized tribes and our federally recognized tribe here in Texas. The Alabama Coushatta tribe is living, thriving, giving and receiving on their land, and it is pretty close to where I am located, what is most commonly known as Houston, Texas. I do think a big part of land acknowledgement and working with our children is talking about the disruption that racism, white supremacy, white domination, as I write about in the book, and settler colonialism has created, and how it has disrupted ways of knowing, education, medicine, health practices, language, family ties, kinship, and so much more. And it's not something that just happened in the past. It's something that is present. And so something that we can bring into our households and talk more about. Again, in the book, there's more information about land acknowledgements if they're new to you or newer to you. And in the chat box, I want to invite you to do a land acknowledgement as well. It can be as simple as sharing how you take care of this land and who else takes care of the land with you. Or if you know the Indigenous communities which you're in community with, you can also share that in the chat box too. I opened the book with a story about our youngest child, Kobe. And so you can see a photo of Kobe here wearing orange and his hair is braided down in plait braids. And I opened the story talking a little bit about my own journey of being an anti-racist educator. At the time, I was a classroom teacher and I was working at the same school that both of my children were attending. And we had struggles throughout the year, particularly with the way that the teachers were seeing Kobe's behavior as a 4-year-old. And I can just remember on Fridays, talking to Kobe and saying, maybe next week will be a better week. Remember to listen to your teacher, sit on your bottom, really begging my child to defy things that are developmentally appropriate, what he was doing. And really the straw that broke the camel's back, as I opened the book with, was a story when I wake Kobe up to go to school. And Kobe said, "Oh, Mom, Miss Garcia told me to shut up." And immediately when that happened, the very first thing that my body did was deny it. I didn't want to believe it as a fellow teacher, a coworker, and just ultimately, you don't ever want to think that your child is being mistreated. But because I'm a teacher, I've gone through enough mandated reporting trainings to know how to handle this situation. And so I say, "Can you tell me more?" And he puts his stuffed animals on his bed and he bends down and he goes, "Kobe, I need you to shut up." And at that point I was like, yep, it happened. And so I called a meeting and I said, "Hey, we need to have a meeting today, right after school." And the teacher said, "Yeah, go ahead, yeah." So in our meeting, I said, "Hey, Kobe disclosed to me, Miss Garcia, you told him to shut up and I want some context." And she looked at me straight in the face and said, "Yes, I did." And I have to be honest, I was not prepared for that. I just knew she was going to deny it, but she didn't. And she didn't really think that there was anything wrong. She made the situation worse by saying, "Well, I just assumed that he would respond to it. I assumed that that's how you talked. I didn't think it was a big deal." And all of those microaggressions that I talk more about in the book, right? They're just adding on, adding on, adding on. And so I said, well, because I'm an anti-racist and we're always thinking about the characters of the people that are involved in this situation. And I said, well, if Kobe was talking, who is he talking to? And it was his best friend at the time, a boy who was 1 year older than him, was blonde hair, blue-eyed, and just moved back from Africa. And I said, "Did you tell him to shut up too?" And that was the first time that she really looked surprised during the conversation, that the question really caught her off guard. And you could see in her face that she was like, "I would never." And I talk more about in the book how bias becomes prejudice, and when it is backed by policies, when it's backed by power or advantage, that's how it becomes racism. And so at that point, I had decided, my partner and I, we decided to pull our children out and homeschool them for a few years as a way to resist white domination and to ensure that our children were receiving love, that they were strengthening their self-love. They were learning how to embrace people. They knew how to identify in fairness, and most importantly, how to act justly. So we did that for a few years. During that time was also the time that I started to write this book, Raising Anti-Racist Children, a Practical Parenting Guide. And I have to tell you, there's an emphasis on a practical parenting guide all throughout the book. You're going to find scripts, you're going to find music playlists, book lists, activities, how to watch television shows, how to read a book together, all so that you're helping your child to have self-love, embrace people, identify in fairness, and act justly. I do think it's important that anytime we're having conversations about topics that can be nuanced, topics that can be complicated, that it's important to either have agreements for how we're going to engage in conversations or have principles of like what is going to guide us. These are principles that my partner and I have developed together, and I talk a little bit more about it in the book. That first and foremost, community is at the heart of anti-racism. Developing loving, authentic relationships is really the goal here. It's also important to remember that children have this natural desire to learn. And because I'm an educator, I also believe that all people have a natural desire to learn, but we're focused on children here. And so as they're learning, there's going to be things that they learn incorrectly. There's going to be conclusions that they draw that's going to be incorrect. They're going to pick up misconceptions. They're going to pick up myths. And it is our job as adults, as grownups, to meet them where they are and say, oh, I think I know why you think that. And that's not exactly true. Let me help you. An anti-racist prepared environment is imperative. And essentially that means anywhere where the child is going to spend time. I share towards the end of the book a story about how we talked about the murder of Philando Castile. And it was a very impromptu conversation that I had no idea was going to happen. I did not at all have it planned. But as you read that story, one of the things I want you to pull out is that the environment was prepared for the conversation, and the conversation happened among friends and community. And so when we're able to have an environment that is prepared, and we're also able to have a conversation when we're with our friends, when we're in a space of love, that then it doesn't seem so big and so heavy and so daunting that I'm going to end up avoiding it. And instead, I can actually go towards it and lean into the conversation. One big thing I always love to remind folks is that caregivers, educators, grownups, we're learning and unlearning. So buckle up, enjoy the ride, and pace yourself. And last but not least is to focus on the outcomes. I know there's so many folks that are tuning in today. And if I asked you, can you tell me some things that you've done to practice anti-bias, anti-racism, equity work, inclusion work, you're going to rattle off a ton of things. And then I'm going to ask you, do you feel tired? Do you feel exhausted? Maybe you've even stopped altogether. It is so important that you have an outcome. In the book, my outcome, I'm going to say it again, so that my children have self-love, they know how to embrace people, they know how to identify in fairness, and they know how to act justly. That is our outcome. And so we intentionally choose activities and actions that are going to lead to that outcome so that we are actually meeting a goal instead of experiencing resistance. Here are some stop and think questions, and you're going to find stop and think questions all throughout my book, because I do think it's important that your parenting partners and you are having honest conversations. There's work that we do with our children, and then there's work that we do for ourselves. And I don't want anyone to ever try and skip over one or the other. And so the work that I do for myself is having conversations with my peers. Your parenting partners can be anyone who's helping you to raise your child. It could be your spouse, it could be your sister, your brother-in-law, your parents, your in-laws. It could be friends, it could be coworkers, anyone who is having an impact on your child or your parenting partners. And I want you to start by asking them, what is your earliest memory of noticing people with different hair texture, eye color, hair color, skin color, abilities? How young were you? Was there maybe a specific story about being at the beach or participating in basketball club? Maybe you started a new school. Maybe someone noticed something about you. Maybe it wasn't that you noticed something about someone else. How did that conversation go? I'm curious to know, were there any adults in your life that helped you, intentionally, explicitly helped you to think about human diversity, to accept it, to respect it, to talk about it, to be comfortable and confident around human diversity? Was that a conversation that you were having consistently around the dinner table, or while you were out shopping, grocery shopping, shopping for back to school clothes? Or is this a conversation that was pretty taboo, right? Maybe it was something that you said. Maybe you were at the checkout line and you said something like, where's her thumb? She's missing a thumb. Or mommies can't be in wheelchairs. That's not a mommy. Maybe you had an adult that said, shh, we will talk about it in the van. And then the conversation never happened. What messages did you get either directly or indirectly from media, faith-based community if you're a part of one? It could be school, curriculum, textbooks. Who was centered? Who was always visibilized in those conversations? Who was praised? Who got to be the hero and the villain and the supporting characters? Who was absent, missing, erased, or kind of always had the same story told about them? As a child, what did you learn by talking about differences? And the last question is really, really important. How comfortable and confident do you feel today talking about race, racism, sexual orientation, gender identity, socioeconomic status, both with your peers, but also with your children? If anyone would like to share in the chat box, feel empowered to share in the chat box, or take a copy, a screenshot of this screen, and go to your parenting partners and start the conversation. It's never too early and it is never too late. In the book, I share my framework for cultivating liberation. You'll notice that the framework starts in community. I talk extensively about why having a strong community is so important, and also having a very diverse community. As we start our work in community, that is automatically going to mean that we are also raising our awareness. We're going to learn things about ourselves. We're going to learn things about our friends. We're going to learn things about other communities. We're going to notice how they experience the world and how the world experiences them, and vice versa. And then last but not least, there's a big piece of accountability. It's not just about knowing that racism exists or being able to rattle off definitions, but it's thinking about how can I make choices in my home with my children so that we can create different outcomes. And as you make those choices, asking yourself, are we actually creating the outcome that we set out to create? And so we just keep going through that cycle. There's a lot of conversation that happens around bias, whether it's unconscious or implicit bias. And I think that it's important for us to get grounded on that conversation bias, especially how it pertains to children. So these are one of those questions I always love to throw out when I'm working with educators. How many biases exist? And I'll get any response between 1 to infinity, right? And so I'll have someone that's like 3, 227, anywhere in between there. And essentially what I want them to know, and you can Google this chart to see this cognitive bias codex that I think is really powerful. But essentially what I want them to know is we've been able to categorize about 180 biases. And right there in the middle of that chart is a brain, and it's essentially representing your brain. This is your brain. If you have a brain, you have bias. And the easiest way that I can explain bias to children is I just let them know that our brain is like the OG computer processor. It's taking in so much information. Every moment that we are awake, our brain is taking in information that's helping us to make decisions. Are we safe? Are we in danger? Is this something that I should remember? Do I need to know this information right now? Think about it. Even in this moment, your brain is helping you to figure out what you should focus on. Hang on really quick, my screen over here froze. Even in the moment, your brain is helping you to figure out what is it that I should be focusing on in this conversation, right? Should I listen to Britt's words? I'm looking at Britt, but then you also might be sitting in a chair. Your room might be really cold. You might have a fan that's on, and your brain could be filtering all of that information out. So the bias that's working in your brain are the shortcuts your brain makes to help you to make fast decisions. Not the best decisions, y'all. Fast decisions. So I always try to get that across to children, is that your brain is helping you to make fast decisions so that you can move through life quicker, and that we would never want to be without bias. Sometimes I'll have children will ask me that, well, how do I get rid of bias? And I'll say, oh, no. That would be a really hard life to live. Like, think about it. What if you went out to dinner and the server comes over and one of the first questions they ask is, what would you like to drink? And then they kind of start rattling things off. Do you want water, tap, still, sparkling? Would you like pop? Yes, I'm from Illinois where we say pop, soda, coffee, and so on. And think about it. If your brain didn't have any bias to help you to make a decision for you, you would have to probably try all of those drinks every single time. And we haven't even made it to the appetizer. At that point, children think that's pretty funny, and then they understand why bias helps us to make fast decisions. But this is really important too, to think about, when does racial bias begin? So specifically talking about racial bias. And we know that at birth, babies look equally at faces of all races. So at the very beginning, a shortcut hasn't been formed so that children can make fast decisions. But anywhere between 3 to 6 months, seeing children start to develop a racial bias. And I share this for 2 reasons. One, I share this because I want folks to know this is really healthy brain development. Sometimes folks will see this and be like, oh my gosh, what can I do to stop it? And I want us just to remember, why might a child look at someone who matches the race or looks similar to their caregiver? Survival. They're like, oh, you look like someone who's going to feed me, love me, change my diaper. I'm going to hold my attention to you longer. That's really healthy brain development, and we don't want to change that. I do include it though, because sometimes adults will think that seeing children who see color are colorblind. Either they don't see skin color, like when they see me, maybe I like present as, I don't know, translucent. And then when a child gets their driver's license, they can like, oh, I see that you're brown now. And we don't have any data to share that. Seeing children see color and react to that. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. And so I always like to include this piece. There's another piece that I always love to include as well, and I talk a little bit more about it in my book, is that there's old theory and new theory. We had this old theory that children learned prejudice from their parents. And oftentimes when I get called into schools, a child has said something, and I'm talking about a very young child, right? 2 to 5 years old, very young. They've said something that is pre-prejudice. I get called in. I said, what did the child say? They tell me. I say, oh my, okay, we can work with this. And then all of a sudden an educator's like, and I know where they got it from, home. Probably got it from mom too. Whoa, okay, that was a big leap. The new theory, the old theory is that they did get it from home, but the new theory, because children are picking up on a racial bias so young, it's actually because their environment was not prepared so that they could experience and accept and understand diversity. So it's out of a lack of exposure. This is really powerful for us as grownups, because all that tells me is that I need to work to prepare my home, to prepare the spaces that my child is going to be in, and so that we can practice. In the book, I talk a little bit more about the difference between curiosity and pre-prejudice. So young children are curious children, and they ask questions about anything and everything. Why is the sun out? Where did the sun go? Why are the leaves green? They are also very curious about the human diversity that exists among humans. And so they'll ask questions. That is wonderful. If a child is asking you a question, that's a really special thing. It means that they look at you as the person to help them understand their world. It's a really sweet place to be. Sometimes, though, children will say things or do things that are pre-prejudice, and we call it pre-prejudice. You can think about it like pre-diabetic. And so if they say something that's matter of fact or doing something that's matter of fact, it is important for us to interrupt those moments. So this school year alone, these are some of the things that I've been called in to support educators. Again, this is very young children. We're talking about 3 to 6 years old. You'll notice that some things are expressions of pre-prejudice, where they are refusing to take ice cream because someone has a limb difference. Young children might inaccurately believe that they can catch, or they can, the other person is sick. A child greets a Chinese American by pulling on their eyes, right? Like being like dramatically slanting their eyes. But a child might also say something like, my brother is so strong. Girls aren't strong like boys. Both of those, whether it's verbal or nonverbal, are forms of pre-prejudice. And I talk about on page 125, I have a SHARE acronym of how you can respond in those moments if you're looking for some support. But essentially in this conversation, what I want you to know is that to respond every single time. You then are modeling for your child that these conversations aren't going to be taboo. You're not going to have to figure this out alone, that you're not going to be shamed because you made a mistake. You said something wrong. You did something wrong. It is a learning moment, and we will learn about it, and we will do better together. By kindergarten, children show many of the same racial attitudes that adults hold in our culture. This is no surprise to myself as an educator. I'm also a Montessori educator. And so in Montessori, we deeply believe that a prepared environment, a meticulously prepared environment, is important because the children are learning just as much from what I'm saying to what they're noticing around them. And so children are picking up, and then they're enacting and believing some things to be true. But here's what's really powerful, is that just having one explicit conversation with 5 to 7-year-olds about interracial friendships can dramatically improve their racial attitudes in just as little as a single week. And a big part of that is confirmation bias is not solidified. It's not very formed at this age, unlike it is with adults. And so we think about it all the time. We send our children to school. We send them to school. Why? To learn. They go to school and they make mistakes. They're like, did you know 4 + 2 is 11? And we're like, can you show me? Can you prove that to me? How did you come up with that? I came up with a different answer. They make mistakes. We correct them. They receive feedback. They correct us. We receive feedback. And we have this cycle of learning. And it's really important to note that children, after the age 9, racial attitudes do tend to stay pretty constant unless the child experiences a life-changing event. And so that is why having consistency is more important than having a one-off conversation, but making sure that this is a lifestyle and a practice at home. I want to spend the next 10 to 12 minutes really talking about a little bit more about some of the language that I've intentionally included in the book. I really wrote the book for grownups who have children, and so it's for the lens of working with the child. My goal is to make the work developmentally appropriate and to make it very manageable so that a child can digest it and a child can pick up the work easily. And one big part that I've realized that a lot of folks struggle with is the idea of unfairness. So unfairness, I think, is tricky because as adults, we've normalized so much. We're just used to seeing something, hearing something, witnessing something, or even being treated unfairly. And we even come up with these sayings that somehow we try to make it okay. Like, well, life isn't fair. Instead of being like, you know what? That isn't unfair. That person is wrong. And I wonder what I can do, or I wonder what they can do to make this fair. So it's really important around when we're helping our children to identify unfairness is that we're practicing this ourselves. So much of this work is about paralleling where I am. This is not about flipping a light switch on and saying, oh, we're going to do an anti-racist activity now, or it's Thursday at 7 p.m., so we're going to read the book. But it really is about developing a lifestyle, practicing and modeling. That is how it ends up becoming this energy exchange and a learning exchange in your household. So I want to share a quick story before I get into definitions. And this story is not a story that is in the book. It's a story that happened last year. So Kobe at the time was in 3rd grade, and it was his first year back from being homeschooled. And he's loving 3rd grade, loving his class, loving his teachers. It's Friday night, and he says, oh, hey, Mom, Rue said that I didn't belong in our triad. And I said, she did. I said, why did she say that? And he goes, well, she said it was because I was Black. I said, oh, okay. And then what did you say? Well, I told her that was racist. I said, okay. And then what happened? Well, Rue said, well, what's racist? And I said, when people of color are mistreated. In my mind, I was like, yeah, that's pretty spot on there. I said, okay. And then what happened? Well, Rue just shrugged her shoulders and went back to her work. I said, so what did you do? He goes, I did what you told me to do. I took care of myself. I got my things. I went back to my desk. I finished my work. He goes, because I am making it to recess, right? Kobe has his eye on the prize, and that is recess. And he's like, No one is going to stop me from making it to recess. I said, okay. He seemed pretty unbothered by the situation, probably because he has a strong sense of self-love. He knew how to identify the unfairness. He had language. He advocated for himself, and he moved on. He was able in that moment to code, there is literally nothing wrong with me and actually something wrong with what you said. So later that night at bedtime, I brought it back up. I said, hey, I want to talk to you about what happened at school today between you and Rue. And he said, okay. I go, I want you to know that what you said was right. What Rue has said, that was rooted in racism. And I don't know where Rue picked that up, but I do hope someone helps her put that back down. And I said, and that doesn't have to be you. Would you like me to talk to your teacher? He said, yeah, great. So it's Friday night, and I'm like, as a former teacher, I'm like, I am so sorry that I'm writing this very long email. I know that you just want to enjoy your weekend because you work so hard every single day. But that's the thing about white domination. It doesn't just affect one person or one group, it affects everyone. So I write a letter and I let his teacher know what had happened during work time. I let her know what I told Kobe, and I had said, I made sure that Kobe knew what Rue said was hurtful, it was wrong, and it was inaccurate. I also told Kobe that, what Rue had said was actually a really old story that keeps getting passed around. And it goes something like this, that brown people and black people and people of color can't do something or go somewhere. And I don't know why people came up with that idea, but it is wrong. It is hurtful. It is inaccurate. And when people share that, that is rooted in racism. And when it's backed by laws and policies, that is racist. And after that, we read our book and he went to bed. But I remember when I shared the story in the beginning about what happened to Kobe, and I said, who was Kobe talking to? So in this story, of course, I have the question, because Kobe said they were in a triad. So I said, Kobe, who is the other person in your triad? And he goes, oh, Daniel. Daniel's his best friend. Best friend in the whole world, and they're still best friends. And Daniel's a white boy. And I said, what did Daniel say? What did Daniel do when he heard Rue say that? What do you think? Nothing. That's right. And I know, I've done this enough to know that Daniel didn't say or do anything because Daniel didn't know what to do. Because advocacy is a skill set. It's something to be modeled, to be expected, to be accepted, and to be taught. And so I know that if Kobe and Daniel want to sustain their cross-racial friendship, Daniel's going to have to learn that skill set. I also wanted Kobe's teacher to know that it's not on Kobe to have to miss recess or to miss something that he loves to have a conversation with Rue so that teachable moment can happen. That is really the adult, the grown-up's responsibility is to help Rue and to walk Rue through a conversation to say, how are you going to make this right? How are you going to make this better? How will you repair the harm that happened? Side kind of part to the story, about a week later, I get this Facebook message request, ding. And I read it and it says, hi, I'm Rue's mom. I think Rue may have said something hurtful to your son. If you know what I'm talking about, please let me know. And I respond and I'm like, yes, I know exactly what you're talking about. And yes, it was to my son. And she apologized profusely. And she said, I don't know where Rue got that idea. That is not who we are. That is not what we believe. We are going to get books. We're going to continue this conversation. We've already talked to Rue about it extensively. Is there anything that we can do to support your family? And I have to say, in the piece where I talk about the SHARE acronym of how to help your child, Rue's mom did that beautifully. I know that it can be daunting to have that critical conversation, but again, so much of this work is about modeling and paralleling. And if we want Rue to repair the harm, the grown-up also has to model that too. Okay, so in the book, I talk a little bit about this word unfair. And if you have a child in your life, I'm not a betting person, but I could bet that your child has used the word unfair before. In our household, we like to use unfair to only mean if somebody is not getting what they need, or somebody is being denied access because of who they are. We do not like to use the word unfair to mean mean, rude, or unkind. If someone is being just like mean, it's okay to just be like, they're being really mean. But when something is unfair, that is how we can start to act justly. So here's an example. If we're going grocery shopping, we're walking up to the door and it's one of those swing doors. The person in front of me pulls the door open, walks through, and then lets it shut right in our face. I'm going to say, well, that was rude. But all you can do really is shrug your shoulders and move on. That's different than, let's say I'm going up to the door. It's a swing door. I need to pull the door open, but let's say I use a wheelchair. Let's say I have a stroller. Let's say I have a walker or a cane. That is now starting to limit my access, and that is unfair. When something is unfair, we can go to management and say, hey, I wonder if we can put a request in to have an activation switch so that you can have automatic doors to create accessibility. So it's really important that when we're thinking about the language that we're using with our children, that it supports those goals of self-love, embrace people, identify in fairness, and act justly. I think it's also really important to practice finding fairness. So many times when I'm working with caregivers and parents, or I'm working with educators, the conversation is unbalanced. The conversation is only around what is unfair. And then it creates this idea for children that fairness is something either not tangible or that it's mythical. And that's just not true. We have fairness all around us all the time. In your household, you probably have rules that are focused on fairness. If they've ever played a recreational sport or a part of a music ensemble, they probably have had some rules around fairness. Voting, in our voting policies, we have rules around fairness and unfairness, but we have things that are fair. There have been laws that have been passed that focus on fairness. And so us highlighting that allows us to know that racism is by design and anti-racism is also by design. All we have to do is redesign it. The next piece here is the phrase people of the global majority. When I work with children, a lot of times right around 7, 8, 9 years old, I will ask them, do you think there's more people of color in the world? Or do you think there's more white people in the world? And what do you think they say almost every single time? White people. Why? Because that is who gets visibilized. That is who is centered. That is who is seen all the time. But that's just not true. So introducing this word, people of the global majority, helps children to develop critical thinking skills, have conversations, and also it helps us to think about when we're saying, are we preparing a household for the world of diversity? It is moving beyond the black-white binary and really thinking about who shares the world with us. Do we represent folks? Are we in community? Are we having conversations? Do I have books by authors of the said community? Are we watching television shows by creators of different communities? This, having people of the global majority, really helps us to, again, exercise critical thinking and have shared language with our children. We were in Atlanta a few months ago and we were checking out, and right there at the checkout line, they have the magazine stand. And there's probably a half dozen magazines right there. And I look and I notice immediately, and I turned to my children, Carter and Kobe, and I said, hey, what do you notice about the magazines? Now, Carter is 16 and Kobe is 10, and we've been doing this for 5, 6 years now. So immediately they're like, oh, everyone on the cover is white, and that's racist. I go, yes, and what kind of racism is that? And they said, erasure. Absolutely. I go, I wonder how come out of all of these different magazines, every single magazine felt the need to show a white person. Every one. To be the cover of their magazine. Another phrase that I like to use with young children is white immunity. This is a phrase I picked up from Dr. Nolan Cabrera. There's the phrase white privilege that a lot of adults use, but I do not like to use white privilege with children. I talk a little bit more about it in the book. But essentially, the word privilege for children is what we would consider a contronym. So it's a word that has two different meanings, but it's actually it has two opposite meanings. So a lot of times when we're working with children, whether you're the parent or you're the teacher, we tell them all the time about privilege. It's a privilege if you want to work in the hallway. It's a privilege if you want to stay up late. It's a privilege if you want to stay home alone. It's a privilege if you want to get a driver's license. We're asserting that a privilege is something to be earned, and it's something that is good and that it's a benefit. White privilege, though, again, is the opposite. It's an unearned benefit. It's not something that anyone asked for by any means. And so instead of saying that, I think what it helps children developmentally, but also assert their critical thinking skills, is white immunity. This also lets us have a more holistic conversation. For instance, if your children are learning about Rosa Parks, when we tell that story of Mrs. Parks, the story then becomes, yes, what did Mrs. Parks experience? Racism. Who caused the racism? James Blake, the bus driver. Who else experienced the racism? The other Black folks that are on the bus. And there were it was Mrs. Parks and two Black men that James Blake had asked to move. So more than Mrs. Parks experienced the racism. And what about all of the white people? What did they experience? White immunity. They had immunity. They did not have to experience the racism because of their whiteness. So whether you're talking about racism, but you could also be talking about sexual orientation, gender identity, socioeconomic status, citizenship, you kind of get the idea. You can always use this word immunity to talk about what the other group, the dominant group, is experiencing or receiving. Okay, this is our last definition that we're going to go through. And I talk about in the book, I break the definitions down, how to introduce the definition to very young children, to school-age children, to adolescents. But what I really want you to know, and if there's anything that you remember from today's session, I hope you remember this. So if there's anything that you can remember from today's session, please, please, please remember this, is that the definition of racism is not people are mistreated because of the color of their skin. If I could ask you to take a poll, I wonder how many people have heard that definition. Almost every school that I work with, almost every community I work with will say that. A child will say, how come they're being treated that way? And an adult will say, well, because of the color of their skin. Here's the problem with that. Who or what does that blame? Me, us, our skin color. And what I want young children to know, particularly children of the global majority that have brown skin or dark skin, baby, there is nothing wrong with your skin color. Never was and never will be. Your skin color is right. Nothing is wrong. What is wrong is the system. What is wrong is racism. And so we're being very mindful when we're working with children about the language that we're using, so that, again, we're helping them to develop self-love, to embrace people, identify in fairness, and act justly. So I do hope that you've already picked up a copy of Raising Anti-Racist Children, or that you have a copy at home, and that you are really working to empower your children, to empower your learners, so that they know how to advocate for themselves, they know how to advocate for their peers, and that we're working with them by role playing, by offering them language, by also modeling that how we're advocating for ourselves and for our neighbors. Again, there's a ton of information in the book. It truly is a practical parenting guide. My co-author, Natasha Iglesias, and myself, I think that we really tried to approach this work so that it was manageable, but also with an intersectional lens. And so we talk about things like anti-Semitism, we talk about ableism, we're talking about colorism and featureism, all within the book. And the highlight of the book is that we invited 15 parenting partners of mine to write a piece in the book. And so everything between how to talk about the pink tax, to how to talk with your child's teacher about hair discrimination is included in this book. If you want to stay in touch with me, please know that you can sign up for my newsletter. You can go to my website, britthawthorne.com. A pop-up will show up, or you can scroll to the bottom where I share even more information because, believe it or not, I couldn't fit everything into the book. You can read along, or you can follow me on social media at Britt Hawthorne. Brandon, I'm really excited to see if we have any questions from audience members.
We do. We have a lot of great questions. Let's start with Anna. Anna says, for those of us without children, what can we do to support others' raising of anti-racist children, or overall support an anti-racist society?
I love that. Well, first, I will say that so many people who do not have children have shared that my book has been so impactful for them. They said, wow, this is really the book that I needed when I was younger, that it helps me to feel more comfortable and confident in conversations and to use language. And I would say the ways that you can support us, number one is supporting your local school system, whether that's one school or going to the district, but supporting your teachers, supporting fair wages, supporting books to be in the classroom, reaching out to a classroom teacher and say, is there books that I can purchase for your classroom or for your library? And as you're picking those books, be really intentional about the narratives and the stories that you're offering, because literacy is so powerful. Our children every day in schools are spending at a minimum of 120 minutes, 2 hours at least a day, reading. So books are going to be really impactful, a lot of bang for your buck right there. And then the other thing that I would suggest for folks who don't have children to support us is this offering resources whenever you can, whether it is to your nieces or your nephews, thinking about how you can prepare your home if they come and visit, or thinking about when you're going places. How are you also helping to make sure that that space is inclusive and accessible as well? There's times that I'll call ahead and say, hey, I just want to know, do you have an elevator? And does the elevator work? Right? Making sure that if someone is parked in an accessible parking spot and they don't have the accessible tags, that you go and you let the owners know and say, hey, it's not that I want to get this car towed, but I do want to make sure that we keep that spot available for folks who need it. If we can find the owner, I can help you with that. So thinking about how you're being a neighbor to create a more fair and equitable space.
Wonderful. Great advice. Thank you. So you mentioned education and books, and Abby has a question saying there has been a drastic increase and rise in book banning and challenging school library materials, especially in Texas, where Abby lives, I guess.
Me too.
Do you have any suggestions on how we can best advocate for stronger collections addressing anti-racism in an academic or school setting?
I do. I'm also located in Texas. I think first and foremost, know the district that you're working within. And I have to say that because there's a district over in East Texas or West Texas that is having banned books, doesn't mean your local district is doing that. My district is not. And so then my responsibility becomes, how am I sharing and supporting? If you're in a district that's having banned books, then start to figure out what exactly is banned, who is banning it, why is it banning it, and where it's being banned. The where is important, because a lot of the book banning is banning in the inside of the classroom. So a teacher is not supposed to have the book, but it does not extend to the school library. So then you can still purchase a book. You can still say, well, how can we make hall room collections? And instead of each individual teacher having their own book collection, maybe it becomes a collection in the hallway. So we have to be creative in the ways that we're being resistant, but that means that we have to know what exactly the book ban is about. The other thing is, if let's say they book one specific, let's say they booked, I'm going to make up a book here. This book is not banned. I'm just making it up because I have it right next to me. Let's say the book Separate is Never Equal, which is an amazing book. Let's say this one is banned. Okay, well, this book is going to be about the desegregation. I'm just going to find a different book about desegregation and make sure that my child's teacher has that book about desegregation so the kids are still receiving the message.
Okay, very good.
You know what, and I have one other suggestion too. actually 2 more suggestions. I also think it's really important that we're just as loud and proud about and being very visible. So going to your local school board meetings and saying, I support having these books in my child's collection so that my child has access to it. I think that's important. Making sure that you're loud and proud on social media and saying, I do not support banning of books. I do want to have these books. And then the last thing is, if you have any lending libraries in your community, purchase books that are banned, put those in those lending libraries.
Great tips. Thank you so much. Bonnie is saying, I'm a teacher of high school students. Any advice for discussing racism or anti-racism in a predominantly white classroom with only 1 to 2 students of color?
Yes. So first and foremost, you're probably already familiar with some amazing organizations out there that specialize in adolescent resources. In case that you're not, or anyone else, I highly suggest Learning for Justice, formerly known as Teaching Tolerance, but Learning for Justice has some incredible resources like Let's Talk and Speak Up at School. They'll emphasize how to create community agreements so that you can create a brave space in your classroom. I also have an educator's guide through First Book that you can Google and find, and that's probably about 50 pages that I wrote with other educators that's supportive. Facing Hard History and Ourselves, along with Rethinking Schools, are all amazing resources. I think the biggest thing is, first and foremost, making sure that you have community agreements. What is it that you're going to tolerate and what are you not going to tolerate? In my classroom, I never tolerate hurtful comments that are rooted in any kind of ism or name calling, insults, slurs will never be tolerated. I make that very clear. I let them know, if you say something, whether intentionally or unintentionally, don't worry, because I will correct you. And having conversations and correct folks every single time. The other thing is making sure that you're checking in with your 1 or 2 students of color. Not as a way for them necessarily to opt out of the work, but making sure that they're feeling like that they're not being highlighted and that we're not asking them to do any additional work. They're already experiencing racism, so I'm not asking them to then have to come up with a lesson plan or choose a book or educate or call in, right? The idea about microaggressions is important for our children to identify them so they don't internalize them. But it's not always a children's position to have to advocate against it. So if I'm the educator and I hear a microaggression, I'm going to check in with that child of color and be like, hey, do you believe that to be true about yourself? And they might be like, no, I don't even know what they're talking about. I can't rap or I can't dance or whatever. Oh, okay. I'm going to go ahead and correct that with them. Are you okay with that? Or did you want to say something? And then I'm going to go and say, oh, it sounds like you've picked up a stereotype. Not quite for sure if you knew that, but that's a stereotype. And that does go against one of the things that I don't tolerate in the classroom.
Very good. Thank you. I'm gonna segue a little bit because we have a lot of questions about parenting in general. So Mel says, how do you raise anti-racist children when your partner is on the other side of the so-called political spectrum as you are and doesn't believe it's a thing?
Okay, so that is going to be very tricky. What I would suggest is first starting with values. So skip over politics, go to values first. Think about the shared values that y'all have together. Maybe you want your children to be empathetic, compassionate, generous, caring. Maybe you want them to be honest. Think about those values and tie your anti-racism practice to those values about how being empathetic, compassionate, generous, honest, all has to do with anti-racism. The other thing I think is really important is starting with those stop and think questions that I have, because that will show up during those conversations. Like, you know what? I did remember, or we didn't have those conversations, huh? And as you go through the book, there's so many different activities that I have in there. Even if you go to different grocery stores and different zip codes, noticing who has what and being like, I wonder why the city didn't invest in sidewalks over here or stoplights or crosswalks. And how do those things keep us safe versus a community or a neighborhood that doesn't have those?
Rebecca is asking, what can you do to cultivate racial diversity and acceptance for your children when you don't live in a racially diverse area? I think maybe that would go kind of hand in hand with some of your tips for the classroom as well.
Yes. And I talk more about that in the book too. So I have a really long answer with some strategies in the book of what happens when white families live in predominantly white neighborhoods. What can they do? First and foremost, you want to start with the materials in your home. Make an expectation. So in our household, we're raising Black children, Black boys. So when they were young, my partner and I had the expectation that our children were only going to watch shows that had the main character had to be Black. So we intentionally and exclusively centered that. And then as they become 6, 7, and they start to go to school and have friends and they want to watch the same things, it's a bit different. So create an expectation in your household. And it's okay to tell your child, you know what? You've watched the last 3 shows that you have watched all had white main characters. We need to pick something else. Why don't you rewatch or watch this instead? So first start with the materials. Also start with expectations, having conversations, holding yourself accountable. The other thing is travel. Travel. Go to different zip codes, go to another neighborhood, not necessarily to make friends, right? Because that's a beautiful thing about children. You go to a different park, they somehow make friends. You go to a grocery store, they're talking to the person in the bakery aisle. So you're going to have to travel. You're going to have to move out of your kind of comfort zone, go into the city, go downtown, wherever that place is for you all, and start to say, when we grocery shop once a month, we're going to go to this other grocery store, or we're going to go to a different park, playground, community center. We will sign up for swimming lessons in a different area and make that commitment.
Mm-hmm. Great. We have quite a few questions about biracial households and biracial children. Heather and Alyssa are saying, I'm in an interracial marriage, and how do you navigate when one parent is a person of color and when the other parent is white and have different experiences?
Yeah. First of all, know that diversity makes y'all stronger. It makes you stronger, and it allows your child to be able to have essentially multiple consciousness and experiences for other people. So growing up, my mom is white, my dad is Black. There was not a day that didn't go by that we did not talk about race, culture, differences by any means. My mom, who was white, she was one of the very first books I could remember reading with her in middle school was Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? So she played a huge role in helping me to develop a positive racial identity and to have language. I remember asking her, I'm like, Mom, when I take the test, I don't know, this was back in the day, so we didn't have a multiracial or like Mark II, you had to pick one box for your racial identity. And I was like, what do I pick? And she's like, oh, you pick Black. And I'm like, but you're white. And she's like, you're right. I'm white. She's like, you are a Black girl with a white mom. And if you have friends and you get to know each other, you can tell folks that you're Black, biracial, but essentially what the paperwork is asking of you is, is there people of color that are represented in this school? So being able to have those conversations and saying like, wow, yeah, I went to the grocery store. Nobody profiled me. No one followed me. That is immunity. I experienced it. And how am I using that? And your partner can talk about, wow, I got pulled over yet again from the police and I did nothing wrong. Having those conversations allows your child to have a more honest and realistic experience of what is happening in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Great. Kate is saying, can caregivers go too far in conversations with kids about race?
I want to say yes, but I want to say no. I do think there's this balance of like, I don't want to overshare, but I also don't want to sugarcoat. I think that as long as the conversation is developmentally appropriate, meaning we want to keep things short, sweet, simple, and we want to keep it as a conversation. It's not about me bestowing knowledge, right, to my 8-year-old and being like, well, let me tell you about the story, the history of redlining. Have a seat because you'll be here for 90 minutes. But it becomes this conversation of like, have you ever noticed how in some places they have no trees? The city has not built trees. And in other neighborhoods, they have trees that are over 100 years old. when you have that curiosity with your children, or you can even ask children as young as 8, you can ask them, have you ever heard anyone using words like Black or white or Asian to describe themselves? Have you ever thought about what words you would use? You can ask them. A lot of people talk about racism. What do you know? Being curious and inviting them into the conversation, I don't think you can go too far as long as it's being child-led. So it's a great question. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to ask one more question to close out. We've had several people ask about resource lists and book lists. John asked about anti-Semitism resources. We had Suzanne just ask, can you please furnish a book list with suggestions for appropriate aged parents? And Lance wants to know, where can I find global majority reading list? So I think
love books.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I think this is great. Okay, I'm going to tell you 3 different places that you can look for book lists. One, I have a bookshop account, and on my bookshop account, I have books around Jewish identity and around anti-Semitism, books that tackle anti-Semitism for children. So on my bookshop, if you go to bookshop.org and type in Britt Hawthorne, you'll find it. The second resource that I want to share is on Instagram. I'm always sharing books on my Instagram account at Britt Hawthorne. And then the third place that I love looking for books is a website called socialjusticebooks.org. I'm pretty sure it's socialjusticebooks.org. They have a ton of book lists that have been curated by anti-bias, anti-racist professionals. And the books on there are amazing. They update it every year. And so you'll find some books that are pretty old. They're like goodies, but they're old. And you also find some really modern books on there too. So books are amazing. Books are a great tool to have like an entryway into this work.
Great. Thank you so much, Britt. Thank you so much for being here, for your time, for your wisdom that you've imparted upon all of us today. Thank you so much for the work that you do.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Brandon, for having me. Thank you for everyone for tuning in. And I want you to know I am rooting for you.
I also want to extend a huge thank you to all of our audience members for joining us for this author talk today. Without your support, of course, none of this would be possible. So we thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. Below the live stream video, you can find a link to Britt's book. Thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you all on May 10th when we speak to Oscar-nominated screenwriter and stand-up comedian Jenna Friedman about her book, Not Funny, and on May 20th when we talk to New York Times bestselling YA author Courtney Summers about their newest book, I'm the Girl. You can register for these and lots of other great events on your library's event page. I am Brandon Adler, and thank you for joining us. Have a good day.